The CIA always thought it was better than every other government agency. You want to know the truth? It's worse.
I was the best they had, one of the best they had. So imagine what the rest of it looks like.
This is the best and the brightest of the CIA. It's a legend built out of wax.
In late 1976, the CIA was struggling to refurbish its image. The congressional testimony of former directors, along with disclosures about the Watergate and Chilean coup, had tarnished its image and made its obsession with secrecy an object of ridicule. The CIA began recruiting new agents in special radio spots.
790 WQXI AM with the JJ and the Cowboy Show. We have a commercial we think you're going to enjoy.
We're the Central Intelligence Agency, looking for very special people to train for a career with us. You may be one of them. If you are certain you qualify, call for a confidential interview.
Secret agent man and taking away your name.
Jimmy Carter takes office, firmly determined to erase the CIA's dark years and then its covert operations and low-handed tactics.
You have to be even more pure and more clean and more decent and more honest than almost any persons who serve in government.
President Carter names Admiral Stansfield Turner, a fellow student at the U.S. Naval Academy, to head up the agency. Turner is reviled by the CIA's rank and file. 1 year earlier, he testified before Congress about the agency's misdeeds in the 1960s.
And again, I want to express my complete appreciation and confidence in Admiral Stan Turner, whose responsibilities under this executive order will be greatly magnified.
There was considerable skepticism about an outsider coming in as opposed to a professional CIA person.
When Turner came in, there was a lot of pressure for the CIA to reveal some of its secrets about what it had done in Congo and various other places. And he was the one who had to go before the congressional committees. And I think a lot of the people in the CIA are part of a culture that says you never talk about these things. Just always say, just lie, don't admit it. And Turner went out and admitted these things.
He came in, I think, with a view that he was going to kind of clean up the CIA a little bit or change its culture a little bit.
But the whole culture of the CIA is against transparency. You don't want people to know what you're doing.
He tried to change the organization, I think, in a pressure the organization in ways that it didn't like. Bureaucracies don't like people to come in and try to change them.
His style of meeting with all the lower level people and bypassing senior people tended to antagonize some of the senior staff, and that created some problems.
I don't think the CIA liked the style of kind of opening up the agency to greater public scrutiny. I think Turner's view was that you can't keep this agency completely secret after Watergate.
Stan came into the agency feeling that the agency had been too autonomous, it had been too fragmented, that the DDO in particular was out of control.
I think he was always a little uncomfortable with clandestine operations.
Stansfield Turner was a good person with good intentions who suffered the same disease that most Navy admirals suffer. He had an overwhelming faith in technology and he had no faith in people.
They felt that somebody from the outside wasn't able to make decisions about spying techniques and such forth.
This guy is so strange, very strange guy, Turner. He is a real history.
Stansfield Turner will be remembered for nearly launching a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union due to a misinterpretation that made U.S. experts believe a missile had been fired at the United States.
It was a mistake. There was a problem. It gave some indicators that there might be an attack coming. You can artificially put into this radar a signal that says, here come missiles, so that the people watching that radar every day and day in and day out know what it is going to look like, what they're going to look for. Somebody can push the wrong button and you get this artificial picture coming in. You see what I mean? And so then you look at these others and you say, nothing's going on. What's wrong here? And somebody says, oh, we pushed the wrong button.
He's crazy, that guy. Personally, he's a little nutty, Turner.
There are people who think he was the worst director we've had, and there are people who disagree with that and think that he was okay. He certainly, in my view, was not our best director.
I'm not sure that Stansfield Turner's period as director will be regarded as a good time for either the American people or the CIA.
He did more damage to the CIA than the Church and Pike commissions. He and Schlesinger and a few others managed to kill the clandestine service.
Shortly after taking office, Jimmy Carter pardons conscientious objectors to the Vietnam War. He makes the Middle East his top priority. After 13 days of talks with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat at Camp David, Israel and Egypt sign a separate peace agreement. But Iran will hand Carter his first failure, and a scathing one. But in mid-August 1978, the CIA gave President Carter erroneous intelligence about Iran, saying the country was not on the brink of a revolution or even moving towards it. William Quandt was senior staff member for the Middle East on the National Security Council.
The Iranian Revolution, that's a major turning point. I think it is probably true that before 1979, we in the United States, and I would say probably most other countries as well, had not yet taken Islamic militancy very seriously.
We were surprised in Iran. Neither the Department of State nor the Central Intelligence Agency understood that a revolution was coming.
When all the unrest began in Iran, the Deputy National Security Advisor in the Carter administration, with whom I was working, asked CIA for any information they had on Islamic fundamentalism. And the answer that came back was they'd never heard of it.
The Ayatollah Khomeini, exiled in Neauphle-le-Château, France, has been preparing an Islamic revolution for months. He openly displays his plans to oust the Shah of Iran's feudal regime put into power by the CIA 25 years earlier.
I, the CIA, made the assumption that even though the Shah was in trouble at home domestically, he had very powerful military and intelligence police forces, and that if there were riots in the streets, he would bring out the police and he would kill people if necessary, but he would remain in power.
I know that Admiral Turner has publicly stated several times that they had no indication that a religious cleric living in France would be able to mount such an enormous revolutionary effort.
We missed badly. The CIA and the rest of American intelligence did not understand that Khomeini was going to be able to do what he did in the time and way that he did it.
From the whole time he was in exile, almost no one on the American side paid any attention to him.
And the mullahs became the source of fundamentalism, with Khomeini operating in your own capital, in Paris, or in France. And we didn't take a strong line about the poison that he was disseminating throughout the Arab world.
We thought that they were just another sect amongst religious sects around the world.
And I remember talking to the man who was considered to be the most observant, the most reliable American intelligence analyst of the Middle East and of Iran, who told me, well, Khomeini only wants to be Pope. He does not want to be king. We do not need to worry about the Islamic Revolution in Iran.
The Shah himself, who, in the case of Iran, basically shared that view. He thought that the religious forces were reactionary, backwards, easy to manipulate, easy to buy off, and he didn't have to worry about them.
Ce sont seulement les communistes qu'on met hors d'état de nuire. Les autres, c'est pas tellement important.
He said, don't worry about the turbines. You know, I can take care of them. I know how to deal with them. They're easy.
He was wrong. And it was a mistake that the United States government, in different ways, committed as well.
Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world.
We were spending too much time listening to the Shah and to the people around the Shah, and not enough time listening to the opponents in the regime and outside the regime.
There wasn't a single person in that embassy, including the spies, who spoke Farsi. We were all about first-class travel and fancy embassy dinner parties with the top people who were telling us what they wanted us to know.
The CIA had very little contact with the Islamist movement in Iran. I think the ambassador at the time had forbidden any contact by the CIA with opposition elements. That's always unfortunate when the ambassador does that, because it removes one very valuable source of information. And if those elements should come to power, nobody has any contact with them.
That happens, and we do that. We make mistakes like that.
When the government not only supports a dictatorship that represses its people, but then tells the Central Intelligence Agency it's not allowed to talk to the opposition, I have to ask myself, why have a spy service if you can't talk to the opposition secretly so that that government doesn't know?
Richard Helms, the former CIA director fired by Richard Nixon for refusing to lie about Watergate, is the American ambassador to Tehran. He's been a close friend of the Shah since lending a hand in the 1953 coup that toppled Mossadegh. He even trained and supervised the Shah's secret police.
He was sent as ambassador to Iran right after the Watergate. He was ambassador in the last days of the Shah.
Richard Helms told the Shah that the United States would back him, would give him any weapon system that he wanted. So there was close cooperation.
Stansfield Turner and Mrs. Carter were constantly sending back-channel messages to the Empress to stay and hang in there and all that kind of thing.
It would have been better to decide one way or the other, and we did not.
Jimmy Carter would listen to one day and to the other the next day, and as a result our policy was amiss. That's why it's not so much that we allowed him, that we consciously, Jimmy Carter sat down and said, I don't need the Shah anymore, maybe I can make friends with the Islamicists. It was that he didn't know how sick the Shah was, and he didn't know what to do.
The CIA was very late in learning that the Shah was fatally ill. The French knew about it, but the CIA didn't get to know about it.
That failure was helped along by the French, who did not share with us the information that the Shah was mortally ill.
We knew there was a problem. We misjudged it and therefore did not predict his demise.
We did not anticipate the return of Khomeini. We did not anticipate the reception he would get.
The Ayatollah Khomeini is back in Iran. The United States turns its back on the exiled Shah, who is dying of cancer in the New York hospital. Richard Helms visits the Shah just days before his death.
I saw him in the hospital in New York when he was there for treatment for his cancer. And the first question they asked me was, why did you do it?
The Shah's position was hopeless. And at some point, the United States has to deal with reality. You can't cling to a failing cause indefinitely.
It's not the policy of our government to go into the internal affairs of people or country and try to determine who should be their leaders. This is contrary to the philosophy of our people. I think we've tried it once in the past in Vietnam and failed abominably. And I think no one in this country of any responsibility wants to do that to a country including Iran.
Carter was a very interesting blend of toughness and naivete. And in many ways he was almost schizophrenic because, for example, in the Soviet Union, until after the invasion of Afghanistan, he really never could make up his mind how to deal with the Soviet Union.
Despite Red Army movements on the Afghan border and repeated warnings from the CIA, the U.S. made concession after concession, pushing the détente process forward. Carter meets with Leonid Brezhnev in Moscow.
My appreciation of what happened in the Politburo of the USSR during most of 1979, everybody was sick or drunk, and they had some very wrong ideas. The whole Politburo was in a position to make a fatal error. On the 12th of December, they signed the document authorizing the military intervention in Afghanistan.
We pointed to the preparations for the invasion of Afghanistan, said the troops are in place. We don't think they're going to go in. They made a mistake that time. But the administration knew that the Soviet Union had the capability and had deployed its troops in such a way that it could act virtually any time.
We just did not believe the Soviets at that point in time would commit the kinds of forces that we thought they would need to be effective in Afghanistan.
So we knew they were ready to invade Afghanistan. There was no problem there. There was no surprise, except that we did not know they were actually going to do it.
President Carter draws the lessons of the CIA's shortcomings during the Iranian Revolution, questioning the agency's strategy and shortcomings in gathering intelligence. Stansfield Turner fires 700 CIA department heads and field officers and begins dismantling the agency.
Stansfield Turner was taking the CIA apart, cutting it back, cutting it back, cutting it back.
He fired hundreds of people, made them retire, fired them. I mean, there were a lot of, he got rid of a lot of CIA assets in the field. You know, key people that had been around for years that could do things.
Particularly in the Directorate of Operations, large number of people moved out.
He eliminated some 600 jobs. That was probably too many.
So the whole infrastructure was thrown out that had been taking years to build up from the 50s.
I don't think they had much use for CIA, and I don't think Stansfield Turner did any good at CIA. I think, as a matter of fact, their assessment of the world was probably flawed.
I may not have made the right decision. I may have been wrong.
That's the problem. Men like Stansfield Turner and Richard Helms and others who have led the CIA never look past their own noses.
Look, he was only doing what he was told to do. And that was to remove the human assets and build up the technical assets. That's what he was told to do, Stansfield Turner. He wasn't the fault. The president was the fault.
So when December of 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter turned to Stansfield Turner and said, I want the CIA to do something about this. And the CIA said, what? We don't have any resources. Thank you very much.
Jimmy Carter's last illusions about Brezhnev are crushed in 1979 when the Soviet army invades Afghanistan. After underestimating Soviet aims, Carter watches his house of cards collapse, discovering the world as it really is, neither harmonious nor just. But soon after, he asks Stansfield Turner and the CIA to start arming Afghan rebels to fight the Soviet occupation.
Jimmy Carter was the one that was most surprised in December Christmas of 1979 when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and he flew into a rage. He was very unhappy.
He didn't have a lot of experience with the communists, and he was, even though we warned him, the agency warned him about the invasion of Afghanistan, he was surprised that the Soviet Union would do that.
The world simply cannot stand by and permit the Soviet Union to commit this act with impunity.
President Carter changed his view on the Soviets as a result of that blatant invasion of Afghanistan.
He certainly lost a lot of his illusions about the Soviet Union, particularly after Afghanistan. Afghanistan hit him hard.
Jimmy Carter was so upset because he thought Brezhnev was someone that he could work with. And then Brezhnev thought that Carter wasn't paying attention, decided to invade Afghanistan, and boom, Carter said no.
The Soviets saw a side, ironically, of Carter that most Americans never did see, and that was the tough side. That was the hard side.
What is the option that we had? Not to resist and let the Soviets overwhelm the country completely?
He apparently had a very severe change of mind and immediately agreed to help the Afghan Mujahideen with lethal weapons. And I think the invasion took place on 26th or 27th December, and the first weapons that we sent through the Pakistanis arrived on the 10th of January, which was pretty quick.
And we in the Carter administration started that support through the CIA.
We, the CIA, formed up a very quiet, covert, clandestine alliance of countries to work against them. And we made it miserable for them over 10 years.
The objective was very clear in 1979 and 80 and through the 80s, and that was our objective, and the policy objective was to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan.
How could we predict way back in 1979 that the people we were supplying arms to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan were necessarily going to turn into something as horrible as the Taliban?
We created the Taliban, we created this fundamentalist army, and we did not know what we were doing. We did not take into account the cultural reality of what was on the ground there.
But Carter has another crisis on his hands, one that has stirred up public opinion. 1 month before the invasion of Afghanistan, the staff of the American embassy in Tehran was taken hostage by Islamic students. The hostage crisis and a failed military rescue operation could spell doom for Carter's political ambitions. He's running for re-election against a hard-hitting Ronald Reagan, whose campaign is handled by William Casey.
I believe that this administration's foreign policy helped create the entire situation that made their kidnap possible. And I think the fact that they've been there that long is a humiliation and a disgrace to this country.
Carter was completely consumed by events in Tehran.
President Carter calls in all his advisors. He then decides to open secret negotiations with the new Iranian government to win the release of the hostages before presidential election. But someone working inside the White House relays every move to Ronald Reagan's team.
We know that Carter was close to getting a deal with the Iranians to release the hostages before the elections. The Republicans got wind of this and realized that if Carter got the hostages out, he might win the election, and tried to make sure that this operation wouldn't succeed, because for some reason, suddenly, about 2 weeks before the elections, the Iranians just stopped negotiating. They just stopped.
How did that happen? Because that national security staff leaked classified information to the Reagan campaign to assist Reagan getting elected president. There was an entire intelligence operation to ruin Jimmy Carter's presidency.
Frank Carlucci, CIA Deputy Director, resigns and joins Ronald Reagan's team, soon followed by Robert Gates, head of the National Security Council.
Gates worked for Jimmy Carter. Carlucci worked for Jimmy Carter. All these guys worked for Jimmy Carter. And suddenly, it's just coincidental that every one of those guys in that operation that Carter ran ended up working for Ronald Reagan.
I wanted to get out of the Carter White House, and I wanted to go back and take a senior analytical position at CIA.
I had planned to leave government, so I did not abandon Jimmy Carter, and I don't think Bob Gates did either.
I had frankly gotten fed up with the Carter White House.
And so Reagan comes in, and they all move over to Reagan.
The American hostages are released on the very same day Jimmy Carter hands over power to successor Ronald Reagan, January 20th, 1981.
It was clear that the Republicans didn't have anything to do with it. It was the decision on the part of the Iranians to humiliate Carter by not freeing them until January 20th after he'd left office.
I don't think there was anything to it. I don't think there was no deal between the Republicans and the Khomeini forces. That's clear.
That's all one of those conspiracy theories that's just absolutely not true.
10 years later on television, Jimmy Carter described the behind-the-scene maneuvering during the October surprise operation.
President Bani Sadr, who was a leader of Iran then working under the Ayatollah Khomeini, has made public statements on several occasions to responsible news reporters.
that there was a deal made.
Casey was the central figure. He was traveling in Europe at that time. Casey's role remained a mystery for a very long time. He was the campaign manager for Reagan, and he went on to become the director of CIA.
Ronald Reagan decided to make William Casey the key player in his administration long before moving into the White House.
You remain the eyes and ears of the free world. You are the tripwire over which the totalitarian rule must stumble in their quest for global domination.
Casey was the one who orchestrated Reagan's resounding victory, deftly put Jimmy Carter out of the running. He managed Reagan's election campaign with finesse, sparing no effort and no funds to ensure victory. William Casey's business activities had made him a billionaire. He was also chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which oversees operations on the New York Stock Exchange. Ronald Reagan had limited knowledge of foreign affairs. He gave Casey a free hand to decide the country's new directions. During the transition period, CIA Director Stansfield Turner kept the future president abreast of world affairs.
I went to brief him as the prospective president. George Bush was not there, in my recollection. And I briefed him.
And he'd do the briefing, and the Soviets have this missile here and this missile here, and they're working on this silo shutdown. Very detailed, long briefing. And Reagan would get up and like loosen his tie and say, "Is it hot in here?" And go up and, "You want some coffee? Yeah, can I get you something?" Because he had no interest.
I thought some of his questions were not very deep.
After that, there were no more briefings. Reagan never got the briefings. His aides got the briefings. So we had no idea what the hell was going on.
With his nomination as CIA director, William Casey strengthens the agency's role and reinstates most of the jobs eliminated by Stansfield Turner. During his tenure, the agency steps up its covert operations.
Bill Casey was possibly the most powerful director of Central Intelligence since Allen Dulles.
He had a rather good relationship with the president, and he derived a lot of his authority from the fact that the president trusted him.
He could pick up the phone and say, "Ronnie," and talk to the president.
William Casey was unique in our recent history because he was a man who was co-equal in power with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States.
Casey wanted to be Secretary of State. Casey couldn't be Secretary of State. They wouldn't let him because he couldn't get through the clearances. So they picked Al Haig.
William Casey was a very dedicated believer in covert action. And in that sense, he didn't have the experience with covert action that I have had. And so I was very leery and suspicious.
He was completely unsatisfied with the CIA bureaucracy. And therefore, he kept trying to do things on the perimeter.
Casey was running the CIA as if he was running the mafia.
William Casey lays out his first objective: to reestablish order in Nicaragua, where the Marxist-Leninist Sandinistas took power after Carter hastened the fall of dictator Somoza.
Somoza was a CIA flunky who was a creep, a crook, terrible, on our payroll for years, like 100 other Latin American and African dictators. I mean, we used them. We needed them. That was the attitude. Hire the bad guys, pay them off, and they'll do what you need. It's for business. In this case, bananas, I guess.
So one evening, I don't know, like 7 o'clock night, I went up and saw Casey, as I frequently did. We sat there and we were looking out over the lights over the Potomac, and I said to him, "Look, I think I've got a solution, and what the government and what CIA should do to do better."
The Sandinista policy was hatched by the Clandestine Services Division of the CIA. Casey expanded on it.
There was a coup against Allende, but in Nicaragua, we didn't really have any coups. We take the 500 people up on the Honduran-Nicaraguan border, create a guerrilla operation in Nicaragua to interdict their arms shipments to El Salvador and elsewhere, one. Second, by creating a revolutionary atmosphere.
Latin America always had stormy relations with the CIA. During the Reagan administration, the Casey-led CIA steps again to center stage, leading a decidedly bellicose campaign in Central America. Working through the Contras, the CIA steers the war against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, while stepping up covert actions in El Salvador and Honduras.
I believe that covert action, okay, is simply an extension of foreign policy, short of war. People have been employing covert action since the beginning of time.
Bill Casey was the most controversial director of my time. In many ways, Bill Casey was the best director and the worst director we had, because he got our relationship with Congress in just terrible trouble.
1986 marked the beginning of the Iron Gate scandal. The U.S. sold arms to the Islamic Republic of Iran. The $30 million profit was used to continue financing anti-Sandinista guerrillas, despite a congressional ban on all efforts to destabilize the government of Nicaragua and give support to the Contras. All covered CIA operations are supposed to receive official approval from the President of the United States.
Did the President know about all of this? Of course he did. There wasn't anybody in Washington who didn't know that. In any cocktail party you went to, the fact that he was doing this was known to everybody.
And we had gone through Iran-Contra, and CIA was being killed.
William French Smith determined that under an appropriate finding, you could authorize the CIA to sell arms to countries outside of the provisions of the law. If the CIA, using an authorized agent as necessary, purchased arms from the Department of Defense under the Economy Act, and then transferred them to Iran directly after receiving appropriate payment from Iran. You recall that?
I do.
Was it illegal to sell arms to Iran, taking the profits and moving them over to the Contras?
Colonel North, when you talk to Director Casey about the fact of using...
I will tell you right now, Counsel, and all the members here gathered, that I misled the Congress.
At that meeting?
At that meeting.
Face to face?
Face to face.
You made false statements to them about your activities in support of the Contras?
I did.
There's always been a number of attacks against CIA, particularly for activities in Latin America, particularly Central America. I mean, that's where Bill Casey ran into his trouble in the Iran-Contra business, the whole business in Central America.
But William Casey gets a chance to apply his strategy for fighting communists in the USSR and Afghanistan, where war has been raging for 3 years. The CIA does its utmost to get the Soviets bogged down in a conflict that will last 10 years and finally drive them out of the region.
Bill Casey changed the rules in Afghanistan in 1985. Carter's decision was to harass the Soviets, to torment them, to make life difficult. In 1985, Bill Casey got President Reagan to sign a directive that says, you're there to win. You're to drive them out. And then Bill Casey came to me, and I had known him before from my Africa days. And he says, I want you to go to Afghanistan, and I want you to win.
The resistance was able, in the long run, to defeat the 120,000 troops. We had not expected that. How did they defeat them?
They were provided with huge amounts of military aid. That was very important. The Stingers, for instance, they really made Soviet aircraft actions practically very vulnerable. We lost so many helicopters, and we were afraid to fly low-flying planes at the time. That was the CIA ammunition.
Without the Stingers, against the helicopters, the Soviets would have won.
The CIA was already supplying Afghanistan's Mujahideen with arms and money under Carter. But under William Casey, the agency overarms dozens of guerrilla groups over which it has no control, even supplying them with high-tech weapons so they can attack the Soviets. Anti-aircraft missiles are put in the hands of Islamist fanatics in return for a vague promise they will only be used against Russian. 10 years after the Soviets left, the weapons are still in circulation.
$1 billion a year at the end, a total of maybe $3 billion for the Afghan effort. You know how much the Cold War cost the American taxpayer? $13 trillion. There's not even I don't even know how many zeros that is. And $3 billion to finish it off was a good buy. It's a bargain.
That was a success. The fact that you created a group of people who were armed led to other problems.
In fact, the United States CIA supplied the Afghan Mujahideen with weapons, with instructions, and as we know, Bin Laden was one of the recipients at the time.
The most fundamentalist groups at that time are the ones that we now face, or their descendants, if you will, are the ones that we face.
We did provide some arms to the Afghan Mujahideen, and some of those turned around and are now fighting against us. That's true.
This is an example of blowback, of unintended consequences. The agency took actions to help bleed the Soviet Union, and it helped bring down the Soviet Union. But they did not understand that the people they were helping were not fighting just the Soviet Union.
We shouldn't have had so many illusions about who our friends were in that campaign against the Soviets in Afghanistan.
We didn't choose our allies very well. We didn't exercise very much control over them. And then after we had accomplished the purpose of bleeding the Soviet Union, we did not continue to be engaged with those people. We closed down the shop.
The world then, after 1989, turned its back on Afghanistan. Not CIA. CIA doesn't build nations. CIA does its thing.
We thought the American government should continue to provide support to the Afghans after '89, and essentially the United States walked away from Afghanistan.
And let Afghanistan become something new, a failed state. And that's a thing.
Maybe they didn't need quite so many arms, the Stinger missiles. Maybe they didn't need that much support. And did we create the Islamist movement?
It was a foolhardy and stupid policy that almost destroyed Afghanistan, and the blowback, the effect of all of that is being felt now around the world with this war on terrorism. I mean, we have to look at our own complicity in creating the conditions that allowed a lunatic like Osama bin Laden to succeed in appealing to people who have no hope.
The Soviets are dragged into the mad race to overarm the country. 10 years of bitter fighting bleed Russia dry. Throughout the Reagan presidency, the CIA's Robert Gates issues highly exaggerated assessments of Soviet power, rendering the White House totally unable to predict the fall of the Soviet Union.
As the casualties increased and the difficulties of the war grew, it had the same kind of impact inside the Soviet Union that Vietnam had in the United States. And it contributed, I think, significantly, ultimately, to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And it was very clear that the Soviet Union could not sustain the military budget and the other expenses associated with its overseas adventures that it had been doing.
They couldn't afford it. It was a house of cards. It was a financial house of cards. They could not afford the extension, as we saw. Of course, the CIA kept saying that they could make this go on forever. They could keep spending the money for weapons and so forth forever. It wasn't possible.
We tried to find out what part of the Soviet economy was being invested in military activities. And I know that our results there were not always accurate.
I remember telling the the Soviets that their military budget was 20% of their GNP. It turns out in retrospect that it was much higher. It was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 40%.
I think there was an exaggeration of Soviet economic capabilities, which has to be laid at the CIA's doorstep.
The CIA did not accurately portray or analyze the dire straits in which the Soviet Union had found itself.
You could say to yourself, over the long run, they're not going to be able to support this. We saw that. We didn't see it as clearly as we could have and should have.
We sometimes overestimated the number of missiles they were going to produce.
But you can't look at 30,000 nuclear warheads and say, I don't worry about these people because their economy is going down.
I often, in my own mind, having talked to Soviets abroad during this period, I often questioned, why we thought they were such a strong power when, in fact, they were not. I think politics starts to enter into the issue. Pentagon, more weapons systems.
Sometimes our judgments about the future were inaccurate because we just didn't understand exactly where the Soviets were going.
We were running bomber missions into northern Russia just to see how far we could get. And that's why the Soviet Union ended up spending so much money on creating missile defenses and other defenses, because the United States was the provocateur. That's bad policy. That was just dumb cowboy antics, and we should never have done it.
In 1986, when new Kremlin head Mikhail Gorbachev meets Ronald Reagan, the USSR is on the brink of collapse. The Washington Post wrote that Robert Gates wasn't the kind of guy you wanted to invite over for the weekend.
I have no idea why the Post writes what they do. They had one person write about me on Soviet affairs one time that I was like Eeyore in the Winnie the Pooh series, book series, that I could find the darkest cloud behind the most silver lining, because I was so pessimistic about the Soviet Union.
I was skeptical of Gorbachev. I can remember telling President Reagan that, who rather liked Gorbachev, remember, Mr. President, this is the last remaining communist in the Soviet Union, because Gorbachev set out not to dismantle communism, but to fix it. He understood that it was broken.
There was no question that he was dismantling the Stalinist bureaucracy, but he had nothing to put in its place, and I think events proved me right.
Glasnost and Perestroika basically got out of control, and I don't think he anticipated the collapse of the entire system. He wanted to keep it intact.
I thought Gorbachev was telling the truth. My concern was, actually it began in 1985, 86, right after he assumed power. I think we all underestimated the magnitude of the political changes that he would make.
1 year later, in 1987, Reagan challenges Gorbachev.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I don't think anybody predicted it. I can remember standing next to Ronald Reagan when he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear this wall down, and thinking to myself, well, that's very nice rhetoric, but it won't happen.
So they were very reluctant to put forward their views until quite a bit later. So that was an intelligence failure.
And we had a political revolution in the Soviet Union that we just didn't expect could happen.
If anyone thinks that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War, then they don't understand history. It wasn't Ronald Reagan and the buildup of our defenses that won the Cold War. It was the internal contradictions in a flawed political system, Marxist-Leninism, that brought the end, the inevitable end, of the Soviet Union.
New American President George Bush is at the helm when the Soviet Union finally collapses. Deeply marked by the Cold War and his tenure at the CIA, Bush couldn't believe the USSR was really on its way out.
I did a memorandum for the President based on material when I was Deputy National Security Advisor in June of 1989. telling the president, based on the materials that I'd been reading from CIA, that I thought there was a very real possibility that Gorbachev would not be around more than another year or two, and that we should begin contingency planning not only for his demise, but for the collapse of the Soviet Union.
The fact that it did not predict the day, I think again, the intelligence agencies are not paid to be fortune tellers.
We understood that there was severe trouble in the Soviet Union, mainly economic trouble, but also some political. But to think that that would lead to a collapse of the Soviet political system was more than our imaginations would accept.
Everybody missed it. You couldn't, anybody that suggests you could say the Berlin Wall would be opened on November 9th is lying to you.
Did CIA analysis say that the Soviet Union was going to collapse in the way that it collapsed, kind of imploded? I think the answer is no, it didn't expect that.
Despite what they want to say today, it was, to a large extent, a surprise.
Nobody can predict anything like that, because the one that was most surprised was not me, who was in charge of the CIA side, in charge of East Germany, but Erich Honecker and Hans Mielke, who said, "What is this?" And they're running East Germany.
If we take the service, the intelligence service, with the greatest insight into what was going on in the Soviet Union, and that was the KGB, it did not foresee the collapse of the Soviet Union either, and its entire existence depended on the existence of the Soviet Union.
The CIA could not predict the collapse. But let me tell you, I was a KGB officer, a senior official of the State Security Intelligence. I could not predict it either. We in the USSR could not believe that we were approaching the end of the system.
It was very surreal for someone like me to spend my whole adult life in the Cold War, because for me and many of my colleagues, it was a world which it was hard to foresee it would ever change. I assumed the Cold War would go on as long as my lifetime, and therefore to sit in my offices at Langley and watch the Berlin Wall come down in November of 1989, to watch the Soviet Union collapse and be proclaimed dead in 1991, was an extraordinary experience. I mean, it was very hard to grasp that empire would end like a candle going out.
In November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall opens up the way for German reunification. One by one, the once democratic countries chase out their communist regimes. The Cold War comes to an end.
It's like the end of World War II. Everybody's tired. They don't want any more war. They don't want any more confrontation.
There was a kind of a, not demoralization, that's perhaps too strong a word, but the lack of this vigor, because the mortal enemy is no longer a mortal enemy.
The great Soviet experiment of 75 years or so is done.
Everything had stopped and there were no more problems in the world.
We'd won the Cold War. The West in general had won the Cold War. We said to ourselves, well, that problem's over. Everything's going to be fine. We cut substantially back on our defense budget.
We dismantled our military and intelligence establishments. People said, well, who needs it?
You know, this is the end. We don't need CIA and all of that.
It had to have produced a dramatic change in priorities. Yes, the Soviet Union had been the principal target and basically the rationale for the formation of the agency.
You can't simply snap your fingers and say, we're going to shift all of this human intelligence to other places. It just doesn't work that way.
These people were very unhappy when the Soviet Union collapsed because they didn't have an enemy, so they had to create one.
The end of the Cold War caused us to shift a lot of different kinds of things and try to look down the road and understand what was going to be happening.
The CIA becomes idle, useless, and powerless after losing its one great enemy, its raison d'etre. At agency headquarters in Langley, former agents longing for the days when they were still likened to James Bond are called back to tell schoolchildren about the glory days of the CIA, 3 letters that have become a myth.
This is just to inform kids, a way to put a human face, if you will, on the agency.
The story's over. That game is finished. It was a world where the Soviet Union here and the United States there, and we were in a game of chess to take as many pieces of the rest of the world as we could. And in the end, in 1991, the side that had the most pieces won. And they didn't win.
A few months after the collapse of the Soviet Union, former CIA Director William Colby and KGB head Oleg Kalugin co-host a reception in Washington to launch a video game. With no one left to fight it, the Cold War was indeed over.
Gordon, it's Warhurst. We've got a situation.
Good luck. Every time you think the Americans can't get any dumber, they do something really fucked up.
Relive the past. Discover the